Thank you very much. It's a delight to have such a full room, and thank you all for coming, though I know some of you are required to be here. But I especially would like to thank the organizers of the series and my colleagues in geography planning and environmental who have had me as a visiting professor over these several years. Tonight I want to talk with you about informal settlement upgrading in global megacities, the human rights, property rights dilemma. And as was noted in the introduction, I am both, primarily I am at the University of Wisconsin in the United States and also a visiting professor here. It is essential in starting a lecture of this sort to tell you where Wisconsin is, because I would bet that most of you don't know. Most of the people in the United States don't know. So it is very much, for geographers, you will appreciate its location. When my wife and I travel, what we often say when we get into a taxi and someone says, "Where are you from?" we will say, "We are between Chicago and Canada." Takes us about 3 hours to drive from our house to downtown Chicago. So that gives you a spatial orientation. Here's the outline of what I want to talk about this evening. I want to talk about the phenomena of global megacities and the questions that get raised about global megacities, global migration, and informal settlements. I then want to use the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as the frame, the initial frame for exploring this question of the human rights, property rights dilemma. And in doing that, we'll then turn back in history to look at some classical conceptions of human rights and their relationship to property rights. Then I will come very much to the present time and talk about property in global context and the question of what to do, and then move towards closure by focusing very specifically on this issue of the tension between the human rights agenda and a property rights agenda, and if I can offer, and I will offer, some assertions about the resolution of this dilemma. Let's start with the phenomena. There are 33 cities on the planet where the population is more than 10 million people. This is what is referred to as the megacities. And here you see a map which displays them. They talk about them 10 million to 20 million plus. So in and of itself, 33 cities of this proportion is significant. But what's even more significant is where they are and how they are changing. On the bottom, what you see is a display that looks at the 10 largest cities from 1950 to 1990 to 2000. And what's important here is that in 1950, only 3 of the 10 largest cities in the world were in the less developed countries. By 1990, this had flipped, and now 3 of the 10 largest cities of the world are in the developed countries, and 7 are in the developing countries. The top of the slide then looks at current time, 2014, projecting it forward just to 2030. And you can see that a number of these cities, you don't have to see the details, but what I will tell you is that as a list of 13 cities, the only city in the developed world, the only 2 cities in the developed world are the one at the top and bottom. Tokyo's at the top, New York City's at the bottom. And in between, you have Delhi, Shanghai, Mumbai, Beijing, etc. And what you can see, of course, in the dark line is current population, and the red line is or orange is the projected growth. Phenomenal. depending on which report you read, this is a graphic from the UN Environmental Program making the point that 2006, 2007, 2008, depending on what source you want to use, a phenomenal thing happened, and that is that the world became urban. The developed world has been urban since the beginning of the 20th century, but the notion of an urban world, the really complete transition away from agrarianism to an urban world, is something we really don't know how to make sense of. We don't know what to do with it. We know how to live as in the urban north, in the developed world, but how do you live as an urban world? It's not just that it's urban, it's the fact of the rate of urbanization. Current estimates are that 1.3 million people a week are moving to the cities of the planet. 1.3 million people a week, that is larger than the population of Amsterdam. Time magazine in the United States ran this cover at one point: megacities filled with promise, rife with problems. What's the problem? This is the current, and the issue is ever-growing image of what those megacities look like. This is also a UN graphic, and you can see that it has two black lines, one red. As of 2000, the estimate was that there was 923 million. The estimate is now up to 1 billion people living in those informal settlements in global megacities. And by the year 2030, the estimate is that they will be up to 2 billion people on the planet. So what's the problem? The problem is the quality of their lives. These are people living in settlements where they often don't have access to the most basics of infrastructure: clean water, adequate sewage disposal, functional roads. I show my students a video about Mumbai, which makes the point that in the poorest sections of Mumbai, there is one working toilet for every 800 residents. This is hard for us to imagine. So not only do they lack physical infrastructure, these places lack social infrastructure, and they have tremendously insecure tenure. Many of these people leave their homes in the morning to go to work, as many of us do, without any sense of whether their home will still be there when they come back at night. And because they are informal or illegal, there's the question of the very basis around which they're constructed. There's no attention from any governmental perspective to the basics of safety in construction and maintenance. So 1 billion people today, 2 billion people by the year 2030, living in these informal settlements. The questions that I explore in this talk, and that is increasingly a focus of my work, is about the right to the land that these informal settlers occupy. Do they actually have a right to this land? They are there. They are there informally. They are there illegally. But there's so many of them. They are such a significant component of these megacities, population-wise, often as part of the GDP. Do they have a right to the land they occupy? And if they got the land, a sort of related question, but also different, would their lives actually be better? So this leads us to a broader question about the relationship of property rights, property and property rights to human rights. And that then leads to a question about if it's yes. Well, then what form of property are we talking about? What's the nature of the property that we might make available to these settlers? So this raises a very broad set of issues about the concept of spatial justice and what it means for the settlers in these informal settlements. So as I said, I want to start with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. Much of the global human rights discussion uses the Universal Declaration as a touchstone. It's an origination point. It's a useful growing forth for continued elaboration. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights grows out of the experience of the Second World War and a sense of the tremendous deprivation of human rights that occurred to many peoples as a result of that war. And the question of what should be a statement of fundamental human rights. The Declaration is not actually adopted formally by the United Nations, and yet it is the most translated document of the United Nations ever since the United Nations has been established. Article 17 of the Universal Declaration addresses the issue of property. And here's what it says in total: that everyone has the right to own property alone as well as in association with others, and that no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. And you'll excuse the sexist framing for the time. Now, what we know about the history of the Declaration, and particularly of Article 17, is that it was highly contentious. There was a great deal of argument that went into the negotiation around whether it should be even included, and if it should be, how it should be included. The United States delegation to the UN at the time wanted to mimic the United States Constitution's taking clause, which I will come to shortly, and to be explicit in saying not just property, but private property. But it was only possible to reach consensus about the inclusion of a statement in the Universal Declaration if the word private was removed. Since the time of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there have been a series of other conventions, some of which you are very familiar with. The first one, the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 1, Protocol 1 in 1952, which largely addresses the same issues addressed in Article 17 of the Declaration. In 1978, the Latin American Convention on Human Rights, again, largely copied the statement. And in 1981, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights did the same. But, this is where ambiguity begins to enter it, there are a set of significant global treaties formulated by the UN, which have been signed by the vast majority of the nations in the world. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Starting from the bottom, it's interesting that on a covenant on civil and political rights, there's absolutely no explicit or even implied mention of land or property. In the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, there is no explicit mention, but there is an implied one when it talks about the right to housing as part of the right to everyone to an adequate standard of living. So the Universal Declaration lays out this notion that everyone has a right to property alone as well as in association with others, and no one is to be arbitrarily deprived of his property. But when we begin to look at exactly how the UN itself or others meant this to be understood, the water becomes quite muddy. So I think it's useful to go back to much of the political philosophy that inspires what ultimately becomes the Universal Declaration, and see if we can get an understanding from that. So we find ourselves back in classical conceptions about land, property, governance, and markets. And we find that in the classical discussions, there's an absolutely clear link between the notion of land ownership and citizenship, land ownership and democracy, and land ownership and markets. Locke and Rousseau, respectively, the major inspirations for the American Revolution and the French Revolution, each saw very, very strong and clear relationships between the need for the individual, the citizen, to own and control land and the viability and functionality of this new social experiment they were imagining called democracy. This gets embodied in the foundational statements for each, then, of the French and the American Revolutions. So in the French Revolution, curiously, it's Right 17, just like Article 17 of the Universal Declaration. But in the Declaration of the Rights of Man of 1789, you see this statement, the translation from the French: property being an inviolable and sacred right, no one may be deprived of it, except when public necessity certified by law obviously requires it, and on the condition of a just compensation in advance. 2 years later, in the adoption of the American Bill of Rights following the American Revolution, the Americans said something very similar, though they used many fewer words, perhaps an insight to the difference between English and French, that says, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Both the French and the Americans were largely worried about the issue of expropriation, of physical taking. They were concerned about arbitrary government. They were concerned about establishing a barrier between the arbitrary actions of government against the individual and the right of the individual in this new political constitution. Influential founders in the early American period, the second, third, and fourth American presidents, all were very, very clear about this matter. They talked eloquently about the issue of property and the need to protect property, and how the very notion of a democratic society was, in essence, empty if the state itself was not, as part of its mission, attending to the protection of property. So as I said, this was really about arbitrary and intrusive government, to have a barrier except under the most extreme of circumstances. Now, in this same period, we had the seminal text of global capitalism. Right? Adam Smith, in an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations in 1776. And in an absolutely parallel way, what Smith is arguing that you can't create the foundations of a market. You can't move forward with a market society. This should resonate well for all of you, with the history of the Netherlands. You can't do this without a sense of secure property. That people have to be clear about what they own. They have to have a way for the state to deal with conflicts. And it is when you have secure property that not only will you then have the opportunity for democratic governance, but you will have the opportunity and conditions for a functional market economy. Coming to the present, This is a period when there's tremendous attention to this issue of property, and in particular private property. We find a lot of discussion by the multilaterals and the bilaterals, the World Bank, the United Nations, the European Union, GTZ, USAID, and others, going around the world, interacting with a wide variety of governments, saying, we really want to talk about this. If you want to have this conversation, and in fact, nations around the world want to have this conversation. The contemporary conversation actually builds upon a conversation that occurred throughout the 20th century, though the conversation of the 20th century was largely about agrarian property and agrarian land reform. It was about the bringing to an end the last vestiges of feudalism and moving agricultural production systems into more efficient forms, more contemporary forms, which often meant reorganizing the property systems. But now, countries around the world, and this is just a very small sample, as enthusiastically go to the multinationals and the multilaterals and the bilaterals and say, talk to us about property and the role of property in a reform of governance and markets, as they do, finding themselves receiving it. So this was the cover of The Economist in the spring of 2007. And it's a wonderful, wonderful image, because what it does is mimic the kind of imagery that occurred under Mao Zedong in communist China, where you had the happy peasant on his tractor going forth to create the new nation. Here the happy peasant is holding up what some of you will remember to be the Little Red Book. The Little Red Book in communist China was Mao Zedong's sayings, which were to guide the nation. But if I had a slightly better resolution of this graphic, what you would see is that it says property deed. In 2007 began a process which is moving forward in China, as well as in Cuba, for the fundamental revision of the property institutions which have existed for over 50 years, as each of these nations, being among the few nations left in the world with an explicit communist system, move to further integrate themselves into the global economy. But what was interesting is that immediately in post-apartheid South Africa, one of the first discussions that the parliament wanted to have was about property. Who had the right to own, under what conditions, for what purposes. In Scotland, when there was devolution of significant political authority from Great Britain to Scotland, the first thing, the literal first discussion that occurred in the Scottish Parliament was about the resolution of an 800-year-old property dispute. This was what they thought was the most important thing to do. And again in countries around the world. So why? Well, this is the 25th year, as we're well aware, of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and followed very soon afterwards in the early 1990s with the breakup of the Soviet Union. And at that time, an American intellectual, public intellectual, Francis Fukuyama, wrote an article called The End of History. And in that article, he argued that the West had won. And what he meant by that was that the 20th century had been dominated by an East-West debate of democracy versus socialism, capitalism versus communism, and that now there was this, in the first glow of post-89, post-92, there was this global interest in a discussion about capitalism as an economic system and democracy as a governance system. So the policy question of the 1990s and the 2000s was, how do you create and develop capitalism or democracy? if you're in one of the newly transitional countries of Central and Eastern Europe, if you're in South Africa. How do you do this? You've had a political system. It has suddenly changed. You want to become more integral to the global economy. You want to offer your citizens a new approach to governance. How do you do it? And for a very interesting set of reasons, the answer that was given actually went back to the discussions of Locke and Rousseau and Adam Smith, and argued that if you want to create a democratic society, you have to create the social and legal institution of private property. And if you want to create a market economy, you have to create the social and legal institution of private property. Advocates for this perspective like to pull out charts like this one. I ask you to take it not with we would say in American English, a grain of salt. You must have a similar expression. Take it with several kilos of salt. This is a chart prepared by an advocacy group promoting the notion of private property as a social and legal institution. And what they argue is that if you graph GDP per capita against something they call a property rights index, which they have constructed, what you will find is that the more secure property rights are, the richer people are in a particular society, and the more insecure property is, the poorer people are. And broadly speaking, again, this makes complete sense from economic and political theory. But probably the most prominent advocate for all of this in current time is Hernando de Soto, Peruvian lawyer and economist, whose book, The Mystery of Capital, really took the multilateral and bilateral agencies by storm. For many years running, de Soto keynoted Davos, the World Economic Forum. What I'm about to tell you is not an exaggeration. You could go into the World Bank and walk down to the hallways and peek into people's cubicles, and every single person had a copy of this book in their cubicle. De Soto basically has taken Adam Smith's argument and updated it to the 21st century. So what he's interested in is, in fact, informal settlements in global megacities. And he's interested in the alleviation of poverty. And he has a very interesting set of ponderings. So here's two quotes, long quotes from the book. He points out that the poor have things, but they lack the process to represent their property and create capital. That is, he says, they have houses but not titles, crops but not deeds. It is the unavailability of these essential representations that explains why people who have adapted every other Western invention have not been able to produce sufficient capital to make domestic capitalism work. He argues property is a mediating device that captures and stores most of the stuff required to make a market economy run. Property seeds the system by making people accountable, assets fungible, providing all the mechanisms required for the monetary and the banking system to work and for investment to function. The connection between capital and modern money runs through property. So de Soto argues that the solution for the problems of informal settlements is to give those people the right, give them title deeds, give them the right to own the land on which they sit, they stand, they reside, and they will do what needs to be done with it, and they will become an engine for getting out of poverty and for economic development. It's a powerful argument. Clearly has captured global economic leaders in Davos. It's captured the World Bank. He's had significant influence at the UN. But, as is true with all inquiries of this sort, others argue that his solution is simplistic, it's unrealistic, and maybe even unwanted by the very people he says he seeks to help. And Alan Gilbert at University College London has written a wonderful, wonderful article called On the Mystery of Capital and the Myths of Hernando de Soto. So what's wrong with legal property? Here's this argument, right? This notion that you solve the problems of the poor by creating land, ownership of land. Well, it turns out that there is, in fact, a highly contested global literature about this. That is, case studies and cross-sectional studies, many, many kinds of approaches. And what we find is that legal private property can, in fact, create tenure insecurity, not security, because it obligates the owners to pay property taxes. All these people are living in these informal settlements, and they owe nobody anything. Also turns out to make the land attractive, then to those who can afford these fees and taxes, that is, to the middle class, and thus legal titling can have the unintended consequence of actually resulting in an increase in the number and the extent of these informal settlements. So if you go about it slightly differently, and you ask the question, what do the poor want? If the argument is they don't necessarily want the ownership of land, what do they want? And you actually go out and ask them. Well, they'll tell you that they want a secure site for housing, but of course we then tend to hear that as property. They want clean water, they want to get rid of human and solid waste, and they want access to social and public services. So is this a desire for property? Well, here is part of our dilemma. On the left of this double presented slide are sort of the what's good about property relative to human rights, what's bad about property relative to human rights. There's clearly an argument that it's impossible to really think about the notion of human rights without property being a part of it. You go back to Locke, Rousseau, and others. You can go back further in history if you want, and they're absolutely central. Property rights are absolutely central to a continuing conversation about civil and political rights, and people want property in some form. They define themselves as individuals, as family members, as tribal members, as members of a place, in part by their access to the control of property. But we also know that property has been used throughout history. The claim to property has been used by the empowered and the wealthy to exclude. Much of the 18th century wars, the French Revolution, and others in Europe were about this. So it could be used to impede human rights, and that for the poorest of the poor, the ownership of land is not what's important. It's addressing many, much more fundamental issues of hunger and poverty. So what do we know then? Well, we know that property is a social creation. So we know two things in tension here. We know that there isn't this abstract notion of what property is. What property is in the United States is different than what property is in the Netherlands, which is different than what property is in South Africa, which is different than what it is in India, etc., etc. It's a social creation. Property only exists because the state decides that it can exist, and the state then decides what is private, what's public, and what will be protected. And, as I have said, we also know that people want property. They want to control property in some fashion. So here's my assertion to you as I begin to move towards some closure. I would assert to you that property is a human right, and that as ambiguous as it may be, we have to begin to think more seriously, more carefully, and with more precision about exactly what this can mean in this period of history. It's clear relative to other stated rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, such as the right to a standard of living, including food and housing. How can one have a right to food without a right to land? How can you have a right to housing without a right to land? But asserting that doesn't actually fully answer the question, because the issue for the multilaterals and the bilaterals, when they're involved in places such as South Africa, when many of us were involved in Central and Eastern Europe in the immediate transition period, is exactly what kind of property. Property has existed in many different forms throughout history. Individual ownership, as we have it in the United States, as you have it in the Netherlands, is only one form of property. We have tribal property, social property, matrilineal property, patrilineal property, many different notions of how property may be owned, how individuals can get access to it, how it can be controlled, how it can transfer through time between parents and children. So, should we be, if I assert to you that property is a human right, does this in fact mean that property is, that Hernando de Soto is correct, and we should be advocating for individual property rights? That I don't know. But I do know that in the broad discussion, it's clear to me that the issue of should we be talking about property has to be part of the human rights discussion, has to be part of the development discussion, has to be part of the discussion about these informal settlements. What is interesting, of course, is the fact that property is not a static institution. It's a very dynamic institution. These are two images I like to use in my teaching with my students in the U.S. The top is a picture of the Wright brothers airplane. The bottom is a picture of civil rights protests in the United States in the mid-1960s. In both instances, the invention of a particular technology, the social movement of people to redefine the notion of who had the right to sit at a counter and request lunch, led to fundamental changes in the social composition of what was called a property right. The state stepped in and said to somebody, even though you think you own that, you actually don't own that anymore, because society has to move forward, and it moves forward as technology changes and as social values change. So what I own in my property rights bundle in the year 2014 is not what somebody would have owned in 1914 or 1814. So that suggests that what somebody will own in 2114 will also be different as a function of changing technology and changing social values. So we're in this very dynamic and confused period. There is this tremendous advocacy around the issue of property and property rights, and it is in dialogue with the issue of human rights. Globalization as a phenomena, the globalization of investment and expenditure, the globalization of production is a very big factor around this question of property and property rights. At the same time, again, this tension, this paradox, that it's about globalization and it's about individuals. So, in closure, let me say that I think these informal settlers, this 1 billion people in the megacities of the world, do in fact deserve a right to the land on which they reside. I think to deny them that right is a violation of fundamental human rights. So I think the right to property has to be part of a global understanding of human rights. We cannot shy away from that. But at the same time, it is not exactly clear to me and to many others that this always and only means the promotion of private property as we've come to understand it in the West. Thank you.